The room went quiet the moment he walked in. Not the polite quiet of people pausing a conversation to acknowledge someone's entrance. The other kind, the kind that happens when 40 men simultaneously process the same impossible information and arrive at the same conclusion in the same fraction of a second. The conclusion was this: the man who just walked through the door was not supposed to be here. Not in this building, not in this county, not in the same physical space as the men who occupied it. Everything that these 40 men had built their lives around, everything they believed about how the world was ordered and what the order meant and who it protected, said that the man standing in the doorway right now should not exist in this context. And yet, there he was. Bumpy Johnson stood in the doorway of the Whitmore County Clavin Hall in the summer of 1948 and looked around the room with the unhurried attention of a man taking inventory of a space he intends to own. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He was alone. He was calm in the specific way that is not the absence of awareness, but the presence of complete control. The calm of a man who knows exactly what room he has walked into and has decided in advance how he feels about it. 40 men stared at him. Some of them were holding drinks that had stopped halfway to their mouths. Some of them had their hands near weapons they had not yet decided to reach for, arrested by the same shock that had frozen everyone else. The Grand Cyclops of the Whitmore County chapter, a man named Raymond Greer, who had run this organization with the unquestioned authority of someone who had never once had that authority genuinely challenged, was standing at the front of the room with a face that had gone through several distinct colors in the span of about 3 seconds and had settled on something that was not quite red and not quite white, but somewhere between the two. The specific color of a man who has encountered something his brain is having difficulty categorizing. For a long moment, nobody did anything. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone laughed. It started as a single man's response to the absurdity of the situation. The nervous release of someone who didn't know what else to do, but it spread. The way laughter always spreads in a room full of people who are all experiencing the same thing and who find, in the shared laughter, a way to reframe that experience as something less threatening than it actually was. Within 15 seconds, most of the 40 men in the room were laughing. Some of them were laughing at the sheer nerve of it, the audacity of a black man walking into a Clavin Hall in rural Georgia in 1948 as though he had every right in the world to be there. Some of them were laughing because it seemed, in the context of everything they believed about power and who held it, genuinely funny. The way a mouse walking into a room full of cats might seem funny, before you remembered that the mouse had chosen to walk in and started wondering why. Raymond Greer did not laugh. He was watching Bumpy Johnson with the specific attention of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit any category he has, and who is trying to figure out what category it belongs in before he decides how to respond to it. In 30 years of running this organization, he had seen defiance before. He had seen courage before. He had seen men who were willing to do things that most men were not willing to do. What he had not seen, and what he was seeing now for the first time, was a man who stood in a room full of his enemies and looked, genuinely and unmistakably, like the most powerful person in it. The laughter was still going when Bumpy finally spoke. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried through the room with the specific quality of a voice that has never needed to raise itself to be heard, that has always occupied the spaces it enters with the same completeness. "I apologize for interrupting your evening," he said. "I just have one question, and then I'll be on my way." The laughter stopped. The specific silence that followed was different from the silence when he had walked in. The first silence had been shock. This one was something else, something colder, more attentive. The silence of 40 men who were beginning to understand, without yet being able to articulate the understanding, that they were no longer in the situation they had thought they were in. "My question," Bumpy said, "is for Mr. Greer." Raymond Greer had not moved since Bumpy spoke. He was still watching him with the same focused attention, and the expression on his face had shifted again through another sequence of colors and configurations, and had arrived at something that looked like the beginning of genuine calculation. Not rage, which was what most people would have expected. Not the reflexive violence that usually followed a violation of this specific kind of boundary in this specific kind of space. Calculation, the expression of a man who has just realized he is playing a game he doesn't fully understand and is trying to figure out the rules before he makes a move. "What question?" Greer said. His voice was controlled. Whatever was happening internally, he was keeping it below the surface. "It's about the Hendricks family," Bumpy said. The room changed again. Not visibly, not in any way that a casual observer could have identified, but anyone paying close attention to the specific quality of the silence, to the way certain men's postures shifted almost imperceptibly, to the particular way that Raymond Greer's expression moved in the half-second after Bumpy said the name, would have known that the name had landed the way names land when they carry more information than the name itself contains. The Hendricks family. 3 words that meant something very specific to the men in that room and that Bumpy Johnson was not supposed to know, let alone say out loud in this room with 40 witnesses. This is where the story really begins. Not with the walk through the door, though that was remarkable enough. Not with the silence or the laughter or the question about Raymond Greer. The real beginning is earlier, is darker, and requires an understanding of what had happened to the Hendricks family and what it meant. That Bumpy Johnson knew about it, and what it meant that he had come here to ask about it directly. To understand what Bumpy Johnson walked into that room to do, you have to go back 3 months. You have to go back to a night in April of 1948, to a farmhouse 12 miles outside Harlem, in the specific way that Georgia has rural areas that are 12 miles from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Areas where the absence of witnesses is not accidental but structural. Where the geography itself is complicit in certain kinds of acts because the geography provides the cover they require. The Hendricks family had farmed that land for 2 generations. James Hendricks Sr. had bought it after the First World War with money he had saved from 2 years of working in a factory in Detroit. Had come back south because he believed the land was worth owning and that owning it was worth the specific costs that owning it as a black man in Georgia in the 1920s entailed. His son, James Hendricks Jr., had grown up on that farm and had taken it over when his father died and had expanded it to the point where it was producing enough to employ 6 men seasonally and to send 2 of his children to school in Atlanta. The Hendricks farm was, in the specific language of the time and place, a success story. And success stories of that particular kind, black families owning and expanding productive land in rural Georgia in the 1940s, were not universally appreciated by the people who had decided that the existing order should be maintained and that certain kinds of success were not permissible. What happened in April of 1948 was the specific form that the maintenance of that order sometimes took. 3 men came to the Hendricks farm at night. They burned a barn, 2 outbuildings, and a significant portion of the equipment that made the farm viable. They left a specific kind of message that was not written down, but that was as legible as any document to anyone who had grown up understanding the language it was written in. The Hendricks family survived. The farm survived, barely, stripped down to its essential bones and dependent for the following season on loans from the community around it. James Hendricks Jr. did not go to the police, because going to the police in Whitmore County in 1948 was not something that produced useful outcomes for families in his position, and he knew this with the specific knowledge of a man who has grown up in a system long enough to understand precisely what it is designed to do and not do. But someone told Bumpy Johnson. The network that kept Bumpy informed about events in Harlem and its surrounding areas was not a formal organization. It didn't need to be. It was the specific product of years of genuine investment in a community, of being the kind of person who paid rent for families who couldn't make it and sent supplies to churches and intervened when the systems that were supposed to protect people failed to do so. People told Bumpy things because Bumpy had, over years, demonstrated that being told things by Bumpy resulted in outcomes that telling no one did not. The information about the Hendricks family reached him through a chain that started with a cousin of one of the farm workers and ended with Dorothy sitting across from Bumpy at his desk in Harlem and telling him what had happened and to whom. Bumpy listened to the account with the complete stillness that he brought to everything significant. He asked for questions. He thanked Dorothy. He sat alone for a long time after she left. Then he began making calls, not to anyone in the community around the Hendricks farm, not to anyone in Georgia at all, at least not initially. He began making calls to people in his network who had specific information about the specific organization that had sent those 3 men to burn those buildings, about how that organization was structured and who its leadership was and what its vulnerabilities were and where those vulnerabilities lived. The information that came back over the following 3 weeks was more detailed than he had expected and more useful than it would have been if he had tried to access it through any official channel, because the official channels in Whitmore County were not channels that led anywhere useful for this particular kind of inquiry. What he got instead was the specific product of informal networks, of people who knew things because they were the invisible people who moved through every space and who were never suspected of listening and who had, in many cases, been passing information to Bumpy's network for years without ever framing it as that. What he learned was extensive. He learned the names of the men who had gone to the Hendricks farm that night and the name of the man who had sent them and the chain of command within the organization that connected the decision to send them to Raymond Greer, who had made the decision and who ran the organization and who had been running it with the specific confidence of a man who believed that what he was doing would never produce consequences that he couldn't manage. He also learned something that was not, in itself, surprising, but that was in its specific form very useful. He learned that Raymond Greer's organization, like most organizations of its type, operated with the kind of financial irregularity that was the predictable result of combining significant amounts of cash with the specific culture of impunity that characterized its leadership. Money moved through the organization in ways that did not bear close examination. Sources of funding existed that would be deeply inconvenient if they became public. Relationships with local officials and businesses had been built on transactions that were, in various ways, not entirely consistent with the legal and ethical standards that those officials and businesses publicly claimed to uphold. In other words, Raymond Greer had the specific vulnerability that powerful men who believe they are untouchable almost always have. He had been operating as though the absence of consequences was permanent rather than contingent, and the contingency on which the absence of consequences depended was the absence of someone who both knew what he was doing and had the capability to do something about it. Bumpy Johnson was about to remove that contingency. But he was also going to do something more specific than simply exposing Raymond Greer. He was going to go to that Clavin Hall and stand in that room and ask about the Hendricks family by name in front of 40 witnesses, in a way that communicated something that no document and no investigation and no exposure could communicate as clearly. He was going to communicate that Raymond Greer's world. The world he had built on the specific foundation of impunity and the belief that certain people could not enter certain rooms and ask certain questions and be heard. That world was smaller than Greer had believed it was, and the smallness was not a temporary condition. It was structural. It was the result of a specific calculation that had been wrong. This was the message that the walk through the door was designed to deliver. Not just the information that followed, not just the question about the Hendricks family, but the walk itself, the suit, the calm, the alone, the specific combination of all of those things in this specific room with these specific witnesses, designed to communicate something that words alone could not communicate as efficiently. Bumpy Johnson understood something about power that Raymond Greer had never needed to understand because he had never been in a position where he needed to. He understood that the most durable form of power is not the kind that operates through force and threat and the management of other people's fear. It is the kind that operates through the specific quality of presence that a man has when he has done the work of understanding a situation more completely than anyone else in it. The kind that operates through the specific calm of a man who has already decided everything that matters, and is simply waiting for the world to catch up with what he has decided. Raymond Greer's 40 men had laughed, but Raymond Greer himself had not laughed. And in the specific gap between the laughter of the 40 and the silence of the one, Bumpy Johnson had read everything he needed to read about how the next part of this was going to go. "What about the Hendricks family?" Greer said. His voice was steady. He was a man who had maintained his composure through a great many difficult situations, and he was maintaining it now, though the effort it was requiring was visible to anyone looking closely. "I'd like to know," Bumpy said, "what your organization's intentions are toward them going forward." The room shifted again. Some of the men who had been laughing 30 seconds ago were now watching with a quality of attention that was very different from the amusement of 30 seconds ago. They were watching the way people watch when something is happening that they don't fully understand but that their instincts are telling them is more significant than the surface suggests. "I don't know what you think gives you the right to come into this room and ask me anything," Greer said. Bumpy reached into his jacket. The room tensed. Several hands moved. And then he produced what he produced, and the room changed for the last time that evening. What he placed on the table nearest to where he was standing was not a weapon. It was a folder. Standard manila, thick with documents. The kind of folder that communicates its contents before it is opened by the simple weight of it, by the specific deliberateness with which it is placed. "This," Bumpy said, "is what gives me the right." He did not open the folder. He didn't need to. The presence of it was sufficient, because Raymond Greer, who had been watching the folder from the moment Bumpy's hand had gone into his jacket, had a specific expression on his face now. It was not the expression of a man who doesn't know what's in a folder. It was the expression of a man who suspects he knows very well what's in a folder and is calculating, rapidly, how many of the things he suspects are in there are actually in there. "You can look at it here," Bumpy said, "or you can look at it later. But I'd suggest you look at it before you make any decisions about what your organization's next steps are going to be. Because the people who will be looking at copies of this same folder over the next few days will be making their decisions based on what's in it. And it would be better for you to have read it first." Greer was quiet for a long moment. The room was quiet. The 40 men who had laughed, who had been so certain about the humor of the situation, were very still. "Who else has this?" Greer said, "Currently." Bumpy straightened his jacket, the gesture of a man preparing to leave. "No one," That changes in 72 hours unless something changes first. He looked around the room, not threateningly, with the same unhurried inventory that he had conducted when he walked in. The look of a man who has made note of everything he needed to make note of and is now complete. "I'll leave this with you," he said, with a gesture toward the folder. "The question about the Hendricks family stands. I'll expect an answer to it through a mutual contact within the next 48 hours. He turned. He walked to the door. He walked through it. He walked to the car that was waiting, started the engine, and drove away from the Whitmore County Clavin Hall through the Georgia night in the direction of the highway that would take him back to Atlanta and eventually to New York. Behind him, the hall was silent for a very long time. What was in the folder was real. Every document, every financial record, every transaction that shouldn't have happened, every relationship between Raymond Greer's organization and the local officials and businessmen who were supposed to be unconnected from it, every piece of the specific architecture of corruption and impunity that had allowed the organization to function for decades without facing the consequences that its activities should have produced. 3 weeks of investigation through the invisible networks that Bumpy had spent years cultivating had produced a picture of Raymond Greer's operation that was more complete than anything a formal investigation would have assembled, because formal investigations move through official channels, and official channels in Whitmore County were not channels that led to Raymond Greer. The 72 hours that Bumpy had specified were not chosen arbitrarily. 3 specific individuals had been identified in those 3 weeks of investigation as the people through whose cooperation the information in the folder could produce the most significant consequences for Raymond Greer and his organization. A federal investigator in Atlanta who had been building a case against a related organization for 2 years and who would find the financial connections in the folder extremely useful. A journalist at a newspaper with national circulation who had been trying to document the specific network of relationships between Klan organizations and local political figures and who would find the documentation in the folder extraordinarily valuable. And a businessman in Whitmore County who had been doing financial business with Greer's organization without the full understanding of what that organization was and who would, upon being shown the specific documentation of what his money had been funding, have very strong motivations to cooperate with both the investigator and the journalist. Copies of the folder had been prepared for all 3. They were held by 3 separate people, each of whom had simple instructions. If a specific call was received within 72 hours, hold the copies. If the call was not received, deliver the copies. The call was received in 36 hours. It came through the mutual contact that Bumpy had referenced, a man who operated in the specific gray area between the 2 worlds and who had served as an intermediary in situations of this kind before. The message was brief. The Hendricks family would not be troubled again. The message was delivered in the specific form that Bumpy had specified in advance, the form that he had told the contact to listen for, because the form itself was the guarantee. The specific acknowledgement of the specific question, using the specific words that Bumpy had specified, was the only form of the message that he had told the contact to treat as genuine. The contact confirmed the message. Bumpy made the 3 calls. The copies were not delivered. The Hendricks farm continued to operate. In the season following the April attack, it received a loan through a channel that James Hendricks Jr. was told was from a community fund established by a church organization in Atlanta. The amount was sufficient to replace the burned equipment and rebuild the structures. James Hendricks Jr. never knew where the money actually came from. He didn't need to know. The farm survived. His children continued their education in Atlanta. One of them eventually became a lawyer. What happened to Raymond Greer in the years that followed was not dramatic in any single moment. It was the specific kind of erosion that occurs when the conditions that have supported a structure are quietly removed. When the people and institutions that have been propping something up begin, one by one, to step back. The businessman in Whitmore County, who had received certain information through a third party and had drawn his own conclusions from it, terminated his financial relationship with Greer's organization within 2 months of the summer of 1948. 2 local officials who had maintained specific arrangements with the organization found those arrangements becoming inconvenient in ways they couldn't quite identify the source of. The federal investigator in Atlanta, who had not received the folder but who had received a detailed verbal description of what the folder contained, redirected certain investigative resources in ways that were not immediately visible but that would produce consequences 2 years later. Greer's organization did not collapse. Organizations of that kind, built on the specific combination of ideology and fear and the long history of institutional protection, do not collapse from a single intervention, however well constructed. What happened was more specific and, in certain ways, more useful. It contracted. The specific expansion that had been planned for the county adjacent to Whitmore, an expansion that would have extended the organization's reach into a community where several hundred black families had established themselves over the previous decade, did not happen. The resources and the attention and the institutional protection that would have supported it were either unavailable or were occupied with managing the specific consequences of the summer of 1948 in ways that precluded the expansion. The community in the adjacent county was never burned. Those families were never given the specific message that the Hendricks family had been given, not because the impulse wasn't there, but because the calculation had changed. The calculation that had supported the attack on the Hendricks farm. The calculation that said this kind of action produced no consequences beyond the immediate intended effect had been revised. The revision had been produced by a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit who had walked through a door that he was not supposed to be able to walk through, and had placed a folder on a table and asked a question and then turned and walked away. In Harlem, the story of what had happened in Whitmore County was told the way all significant stories in Harlem were told, through the invisible networks, in the specific rooms where such things were discussed, in the careful language of people who understood that some stories needed to be told in the form of what they produced rather than what they were. The story was not that Bumpy Johnson had walked into a Klan hall alone and placed a folder on a table and asked a question. The story was that a farm 12 miles outside a town in Georgia that nobody in Harlem had heard of was still standing and still producing, and its children were still in school in Atlanta, and that this had something to do with a man who was not afraid of rooms that other men would not enter. The story grew in the telling, as all such stories do. The 40 men became 60, then 100. The folder became a briefcase, became a trunk of documents. The 36 hours became 24. The specific quiet efficiency of what had actually happened was transformed, in the telling, into something more dramatic, more visceral, more consistent with the mythology that was already attaching itself to Bumpy Johnson's name, and that the events of the summer of 1948 were now feeding. Bumpy himself, when the subject came to him, which it did occasionally, would give the specific kind of response he always gave to questions about his most significant actions, something brief, factual, and slightly tangential to the question being asked, in a way that communicated that the question was welcome, but that the version of the story the questioner had received was probably more interesting than the actual sequence of events. What he said, In the one account of the Whitmore County situation that he gave that was specific enough to be worth quoting was this: "They laughed when I walked in. That was useful. It meant they weren't paying attention to what I was doing. People who are laughing are not reading the room, and the room was what mattered." He was asked what he meant by the room mattering. "There were 40 men in that room," he said. "Not one of them would have gone to that farm alone. The 40 of them together gave each one permission to do things that he would not have done as one. That's what the organization was, really. Not the ideology, not the hatred, though that was real. The permission structure. You take away the permission structure, you take away most of what the organization can do." The folder wasn't about Raymond Greer specifically. It was about the specific people whose cooperation the permission structure depended on. Remove the cooperation, the structure changes. That's all I was trying to do. He paused. The walk through the door was theater, but theater has its uses. They were laughing. They were not reading what I was doing. By the time they stopped laughing, the thing that needed to happen had already happened. This was Bumpy Johnson's specific understanding of the kind of power that operated through presence and preparation, and the specific intelligence that sees a situation more completely than anyone else in it. The power that does not require numbers or volume or the performance of force. The power that walks alone into a room of 40 and leaves, having changed the room's essential relationship to its own sense of impunity. There is a dimension of this story that is almost never discussed, that exists at the edge of the known record, and that people who were close to Bumpy in the years following 1948 only allude to obliquely. It concerns what the summer of 1948 cost him. The folder that he had prepared required 3 weeks of investigation and the careful assembly of documentation from sources that were not easy to access, and that were not made available without the specific trust that had been built over years. The people who had provided the information that went into that folder had done so because they trusted Bumpy Johnson in the specific way that people trust someone who is demonstrated, repeatedly and concretely. That information given to him is handled with a specific kind of care and produces outcomes that the provider of the information could not have produced alone, using that information in the way he had used it. In a room in Whitmore County in the summer of 1948 had required Bumpy to expose, in a general way, the existence of a capability that he had always kept invisible, not to expose the specific sources, but to reveal that the capability existed. Raymond Greer and his organization now knew something about Bumpy Johnson that they had not known before. They knew that he had access to information that should have been inaccessible. They knew that his network extended into places and conversations that powerful people had believed were private. They knew, in other words, something that Bumpy would have preferred they not know. Because the most effective version of the intelligence capability he had built was the version that nobody knew existed. He had chosen to expose the existence of the capability because the Hendricks family mattered more than the invisibility of the capability. This was the calculation, and it was a calculation that most people who knew him recognized as entirely consistent with everything he had always said he believed about the relationship between power and its purpose. Power that is not used to protect the people it could protect is not power in any sense that matters. He had built what he had built over years, for the specific purpose of being able to do things that other men could not do when the situations that required those things arose. The summer of 1948 was such a situation. The cost of revealing the capability's existence was real and would require adjustment. But the Hendricks family's farm was still standing, and that was not a thing that could have been achieved without the cost. Dorothy, who had delivered the original information about the Hendricks family and who had watched Bumpy assemble and deployed the response. Over the following months, said something years later that was as close as anyone ever came to articulating what made Bumpy Johnson's particular kind of power different from the other kinds of power that existed in the world they operated in. She said, "Most powerful men I've known, what they protect with their power is their power. What they do with whatever they have is make sure they keep having it and having more of it." He was different. What he protected with his power was other things. The power was the means. What he was protecting was the end. And the end was always something outside himself. The Hendricks family, the community, the specific people who didn't have the means to protect themselves. That's what the power was for. When the situation called for it, he used it for that, even when using it cost something. She was quiet for a moment, and then she added, "The men in that room laughed when he walked in. They thought they were watching something ridiculous. They were actually watching the most dangerous thing any of them would ever encounter. A man who is not protecting himself. A man who is protecting something else. That kind of man doesn't have the limits that the other kind has. He'll go further, stay longer, pay more, endure more, because he's not measuring the cost against his own safety or his own comfort. He's measuring it against whether the thing he's protecting is still standing when he's done." This was the specific quality that the Whitmore County situation made visible in a way that Bumpy's other operations, which were more strategic and more carefully managed for invisibility, did not. The walk through the door, the suit, the calm, the alone, the folder, the question, the 72 hours, the call received in 36, all of it assembled and deployed in the service of a farm 12 miles outside a town in Georgia that Bumpy Johnson had no direct connection to except through the invisible networks of care and obligation that he had built over years. The 40 men who laughed in that room never laughed about Bumpy Johnson again. Some of them, in the years that followed, would find occasions to mention the summer of 1948 in private conversations, in the specific way that men mention events that have revised their understanding of something they thought they understood. They would mention it in the tone of people sharing a lesson they had learned at some cost, a lesson about the specific danger of assuming that the absence of visible power is the absence of power, about the specific error of laughing at a man you have not yet tried to understand. The lesson was not that Bumpy Johnson was dangerous in the obvious way. It was that he was dangerous in the specific way that is hardest to defend against. The way that involves knowing more about your situation than you know about his. The way that involves having already decided everything that matters before the conversation begins. The way that involves being the calmest person in the room, specifically because you are the most prepared person in the room. Because preparation is what calm is built on when the calm is real rather than performed. They laughed when he walked in alone. The laughing lasted about 15 seconds. The consequences of the 15 seconds lasted considerably longer. In Georgia, a farm that should have been destroyed was still producing. Children who should have been pulled from school were still in Atlanta. A community that should have been shrunk by fear was not shrunk. And in Harlem, in the rooms where the real story was told rather than the performed version, people said that the summer of 1948 was the year they understood something about Bumpy Johnson that they had suspected but not known. They understood that the protection he offered, the community he had built his life around, was not contingent on convenience or safety or the maintenance of his own position. That it was the kind of protection that cost something, and that he paid the cost without making a performance of the payment. That was the thing the laughter in that room had failed to account for. The 40 men had looked at a man standing alone in a room full of their enemies, and had seen someone who could be laughed at. What they had not seen was what the man had walked in carrying. Not the folder, Though the folder was real, and its contents were real, and their implications were real, what they had not seen was the specific quality of a man who has decided what he is for, what he will and will not use, what he has built for, what he will pay for, what he believes is worth paying for. You cannot laugh at that kind of man without being wrong about him, and being wrong about him in the specific way the 40 men in that room were wrong produces the specific kind of consequence that makes the wrongness permanent. They laughed. He walked out. The farm was still standing. That's the story. That's all of it. Not the dramatic version, not the version where the truck arrives, or the blood flows, or the power is demonstrated in the obvious way. The version where a man in a suit walks into a room, places a folder on a table, asks a question, receives an answer 36 hours later, and then returns to Harlem and continues his day. The version where the protection was complete and permanent and invisible, exactly the way the best protection always is. The version where you don't know what was saved until you understand what was at risk. And when you understand what was at risk, and you understand what it took to protect it, and you understand what it cost the man who did the protecting, and you understand that he paid that cost not because it was easy or safe or consistent with the logic of self-preservation that governs most human decisions, but because a farm was standing that should have been burned, and because children were in school who should have been pulled from it, and because a community was intact that should have been frightened into a smaller version of itself. Then you understand what the laughter was missing. Everything. It was missing everything. Bumpy Johnson walked into a room full of people who thought he should not exist in their context, and he left having changed their context permanently. He walked in alone, and he walked out alone, and the 40 men who had laughed were 40 men who would never laugh in quite the same way again, because some rooms change you just by having been entered, and some men change rooms just by entering them. And the man who can do both, who can enter the room that shouldn't be entered and change it simply by being in it, that man is the kind of man that laughter cannot touch. The Hendricks farm produced its harvest that autumn. The children went back to Atlanta. The community in the adjacent county was never visited by the men who had been planning to visit it. Somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson read the morning newspaper, drank his coffee, and went about his day. The work had been done. The right things were still standing. That was enough.